Hey there. This is not a monster video. This is, but it is another one of my Monsterology videos. So I did one on Fey Portals a while ago, and this one's going to be more of a sort of a general treatment of monsters and how to use them in Dungeons and Dragons, or at least from my perspective, how I use them and what I do. And when I'm world building, what sort of take I have on monsters, depending on what sort of world that I'm creating. So, for instance, in my current campaigns, I've got two campaigns running concurrently. One is a weekly game, which is just sort of on pause at the moment because it's reached a point in the story where they've finished their quest arc and we're taking a break to play some Call of Cthulhu, and then we'll go back to it later on. And the other one is a bi-weekly game online, which you can watch, which is the Rage of the Fallen Prismar game. And that's the in the game that we just had today, in fact, the players of that game met up with the player party from the first campaign, the weekly campaign, and fought it out. And the outcome was entirely different in both games because player characters are much better at running characters than DMs are. They know them better and they have better tactics generally, which is kind of disheartening if you think about it. Anyway, so when I was designing Prismar, I had sort of a mandate or an idea, a sketch of what Prismar was from Barker and Matt Click, Be a Better Game Master and A Fistful of Dice, if you want to check out their channels, which you should. And this was during BrigadeCon, and they were talking about they wanted these elements for a world. So they came up with these ideas for a desert-type world and a sort of an epic terrain. They wanted a place where they forged glass instead of steel into weapons and items and armor, and they wanted it to have a ring like Saturn. And I thought that was an awesome idea. And I did a lot of working on it and research, and it's developed both in play and in my head, so that it's going to be sort of like my own Forgotten Realms. It's my own Forgotten Realm, off the beaten track and epic in its scope. And when I was designing the sort of monsters and things for it, I really looked at the ecology of the world and how it would make sense. Because I wanted to include as much Dungeons and Dragons stuff as I could. And when you think about it, if you've got something like Forgotten Realms and it's got the idea of hordes of demons and devils and, like, just for instance, hobgoblins. Now, if you looked at the big picture and you had hobgoblins in the Forgotten Realms, they would take over everything. They have prodigious breeding rate. They're completely martial. They're really good armor smiths and weaponsmiths. They are devoted to a god of conquest. There was nothing that would stop them from rolling over the entirety of the Forgotten Realms. I mean, they would take over Faerun in a matter of a few decades if you just let them loose on that world without a lot of contingencies in place to keep them in check. And the fact that they operate in smallish squads of legions, and they fight it out amongst themselves when there's no other targets around. But I mean, in Forgotten Realms, there's targets everywhere. They're a monster that, if you encounter it, it should be in scattered sort of remnants, but not at their full strength. You're never going to meet a hobgoblin army in full swing because it would just rampage over everything, really. So there's a lot of concessions to be made. If you're reading about the monsters in the monster manual, what I'm saying, basically underlying, is that not every single monster in this book is going to be in your game, and they shouldn't be. There is a whole horde of monsters in here, and if there are purple worms and dragons and adult dragons and slard and specters and dretches and umberhulks and owlbears and bullets and anthegs and durgar and genies and all that sort of stuff raging around willy-nilly all the time, how on earth is human civilization going to thrive at all? They would be bunkered up in mountain holes, cowering in the shadows. They've got it way worse than humans on earth ever did or ever could. And you know, it's unlikely that any sort of human society that we would recognize at all would rise up much more than a subsistence level. They would basically be cowering cavemen. They would never have developed agriculture and all of the technologies that came with it, including printing. Um, it, the wheel, taming horses. Why? Who would ride a horse across a landscape and get snapped up by a dragon? It'd be insane. You'd never do it. Who would sail a ship across the sea that's full of dinosaurs and krakens and all that sort of stuff? You just wouldn't. You wouldn't do it. So we take solace in fantasy, and we design environments which are not like Earth, and we only introduce monsters where they become relevant to the story. So in a way, your player characters are moving through a terrain which is largely devoid of monsters, really, but they will meet them because they're on an epic campaign, an adventure, like an Odyssey, right? They're Perseus, or they're one of the Greek heroes who's encountering Cyclops and the Nemean lion and all that sort of stuff, because they're battling an epic number of things. If they encounter a lycanthrope, there's probably not a nation of lycanthropes. That would be crazy, but there will be lycanthropy. It might exist, it might be legendary, it might be rumored, until you meet it, and then it becomes very, very real. And it becomes an emergent threat. It becomes an element of your campaign that could rage out of control, if the player characters don't do anything about it. It should come back and bite them, so to speak, if they just let it be. Don't toss them threads which they can just ignore. If there is a threat to if there's a sideline, a side quest, or something like that they've interacted with, that they've set in motion, that's really their choice. And if they then step back from it and just let it go, then have it turn around and attack their home or village, or the person who's responsible for their quest in the first place maybe tracked down and murdered by the lycanthrope, or whatever threat they've uncovered. Um, and don't toss in really amazing stuff that they can't interact with without a good reason. Like if you have off in the distance the Modron March is happening and there's a portal to another dimension, etc., and this big thing's going on, it may be sort of epic in its scope, and they'll may sit back and go, "Wow, yeah, that's very visually engaging." But I mean, it doesn't really do a lot if they can't interact without knowing that they're going to get pasted or ignored, or their characters are just going to get lost in the throng of more heroic beings. Same sort of thing. I have a basic rule in my game that NPCs, non-player characters, are never a higher level than the player characters are. And if they are, they'll generally be patrons. So they'll be ordering them to do something and offering them rewards and things like that. But they won't travel along with them. It's beneath them. That's why they're sending underlings to go and do it for them. If the adventurers then discover something that would have been appropriate for the level of that hero, they can possibly call them in to do battle with it. In which case, they can advance, leapfrog up in level and things by attacking things way beyond what they would be capable of doing just there by themselves, because they can call in NPCs who are powerful and allies, and it gives them a better sort of grasp on the terrain, on the a better sync. They get more immersed in the game because the NPCs become valuable to them. They're as much tools as things in their backpack. But when you're designing a world, you need to think, pretty carefully about what's the environment, what's the terrain, what sort of effect would the environment that you want to set it in have on the development of technology, language, the dispersal of people, migrations, natural creatures, weather patterns. All that sort of stuff needs to sort of gel around in your head. You need to really put yourself there as the dungeon master, stand on the brink of the landscape, and take a good look at everything and how it all works together. Because if you don't believe it, you're not going to convey a believable thing to your player characters, to the players. If you're standing there and describing it like David Attenborough, they are going to get engaged. If you if you have an answer for everything that they look at, they're asking you because they want to get a better picture of things. And if you're giving them a very clear and concise image of things, then sure. And if they're describing stuff which doesn't gel, which is jarring, which doesn't really make sense, if you say you give them creative license to talk about something in the game, and they start talking about how they hunted Grell when they were younger, and their father killed a displacer beast, and they have a beholder's central eye mounted in their bar, certainly say, no, you don't. No, though you've never seen one of those things before. If they say, oh, my character's a drow, or he was raised by a drow, or his best friend was a drow, saying, no, nobody on the surface world has ever heard of a drow. They know, have these legends of shadows which came out of the caves and took their ancestors a couple of generations ago. But other than that, they know nothing about them. The underworld is a mystery to them, as much a mystery as the Greeks thought. Nobody would have ever heard of a naga or a nightmare or other dimensional beasts. Nobody's ever seen or even imagined what a Nothic is. Ogres are legendary things which may exist in the high mountains or far to the east, you know, until they're there. Only are just bedtime stories until one of them shows up and your kids actually do start disappearing. That sort of thing, And because people don't realize that ogres are real, a half ogre might show up and people would think that is an ogre. Or people would look at him and say he's a monstrous being and incredibly powerful, but maybe he was just born that way. Maybe he's just a mutation. Maybe he's touched by the gods and actually blessed by a god of strength and savagery. And maybe we shouldn't get on his bad side. That sort of thing. Don't have every single town have an assassin's guild or a thieves guild. Those things should be relatively rare, and once you discover them, they should be. It's a doorway into a new world. Don't just turn up at a city and just assume that there's a thieves guild. Why would there be? Certainly, and there can be certainly more than one thieves guild operating, and they would largely be unaware of each other because they keep it on the down low. They keep it very quiet. Don't have every world have a Tarrasque. Don't have every world have vampires. Maybe vampirism is a curse that is unleashed when the adventurers go delving into a place that they should not have gone delving into. Have things buried for a very good reason. Have their crypts and things have a reason. Have them protected for a good reason. Have the rewards be great, but sometimes when players go looking into these places and kicking down doors, they may unleash things which they're going to spend a good part of their lives trying to correct those mistakes. And sure, they've got epic loot and things like that, but as soon as they draw forth these legendary items, people will know exactly what they are and where they've been and why they're responsible for these very bad things. And they may become outlaws that have to clear their name just because they broke into a crypt that everybody had forgotten about. But unfortunately, they released some wights or a spectre or some poltergeists or some ghosts or something. They may have increased supernatural activity and the dead actually rise from the graves. And it's their fault and they have to do something about it. However, they'll have the assistance of a church or a local organisation of some kind. Also, don't have every single church have clerics or paladins available or healing magic. Sometimes religions just are about belief. They may not necessarily have any supernatural powers whatsoever. They could just be basically a cult or a following or a philosophy. They could be like a monk's order, but they don't produce people with amazing fighting skills. Monks could just be old people wandering around and brewing mead. Have a large chunk of the activities with the environment basically involve animals. At the back of the monster manual, there is a large section on just ordinary animals. Some of them of giant size, of course, but a lot of them not. So if you're in a coastal region, for instance, you may encounter a bunch of basically primitive fishermen. Like there's fishermen in the Philippines, for instance, who still hunt whales. They go out on like canoes, outriggers, and harpoon them. And they harpoon maybe 6 sperm whales a year. This still goes on to this day in this modern world. And not 100 miles away, there's people with cell phones and computers and tablets and things like that. But technology is not evenly dispersed across our world, even with its massive technology of communication and printed words and things like that. So why would it be in the D&D world? You could have just 20 or 30 miles away would be almost like a different world. You may have an entirely different culture coexisting close by to even relatively built up agrarian cities. So, that sort of thing. When I'm looking at monster entries, for instance, I take great liberties in play, certainly. I have creatures talk which don't normally talk or are silent and monstrous when normally they could talk. I like to keep it a little bit different so that you never really know exactly what's going on until you're in a fight with it. I like springing things on even experienced D&D players, for instance. I think I caught Matt Click off guard once with ropers because I was describing it in from the character's point of view what was going on and the impressions that they had of what they saw, and Matt didn't immediately put two and two together that the ropes and things that they were seeing were actually the tendrils of ropers. And that's a relatively simple thing. The earth tremors and disappearing livestock and the occasional smashed over building could be the predations of a purple worm that's doing most of its activities underground. It doesn't actually surface unless it absolutely has to. That's how they grow to giant size. They just stay out of mind's eye. You could have pseudo dragons, which are completely evil, um, and but a plague on livestock and people in towns and things. They could steal books and burn them and do all sorts of really malicious stuff. Pseudo dragons don't necessarily have to be very nice. They could be quite a blight. Myconids could take to the surface during an eclipse and cause all sorts of mayhem. Or they could come in whenever they could have agents which set forest fires to create big plumes of smoke and then come in and steal burnt timbers to take into their layers down below to provide much needed nutrients. These sort of things you keep in mind. You look at a creature and you think, how can I take this out of the boundaries? How can I look at this and project it into an environment so that it becomes a thing of amazement? How can I take a mummy and insert it into my campaign world and its story and its history, give it an origin and give it tendrils that spread throughout the campaign so that you may not necessarily encounter the mummy for a very long time, but you'll start stepping on the tendrils of its story right from the very outset. If you really think about your campaign, you can insert things like helmed horrors and ghouls and giants and that sort of thing. You just got to basically lay the foundation and the groundwork so that characters know that they're walking into areas of fantastical, magical wonder where mythical beings exist. So, yeah. Don't have them in a desert environment and then all of a sudden a water elemental steps out beyond a sand dune. That's just, have some forethought about it. Foreshadow things a little bit, but keep them guessing and just describe what their character sees. Right up to the very last minute, right up to the fact that they're in combat with this thing, and keep them guessing as long as possible. Don't surrender information until they're really making their knowledge checks and things like that. And consider their character, right? Their monk who's been sequestered in a monastery for most of his life probably has no experience of what a ghoul is, whereas the cleric would have some idea because he's read manuscripts and first account stories and legends and myths and things like that. The fighter probably knows less than both of them. Yeah, so that's just my little rant on Monsterology and just designing a D&D world. Think about how much water there is, where the seas go, basic sort of stuff like real world knowledge, like the Pacific Ocean creates big cyclones and typhoons and stuff because of its effect on the weather. A world that doesn't have a lot of oceans is not going to have a lot of weather, or if it does have weather, it's going to last a fairly long time. Or if you have a massive continent with big mountain ranges, just over top of those mountain ranges across the plains, there's going to be big desert areas because the mountain ranges will stop water from moving from one side to the other. If you look at the geography of our planet, you'll have a wet side of a mountain and a dry side of a mountain. You'll have a hot side of a mountain and a cold side of the mountain because of the way the shadows and things move and how it blocks airflow. So look at your maps and work out your environmental topography, what sort of creatures live where, and think about how that affects things like human migration, where the elves live, where the dwarves live, where humans would possibly live. If they're living in the only cultivated area, if there's mostly deserts around them because of big mountain ranges and stuff, and there's just one major river that meets up at the sea at one specific place, sure, there may be a human city there, but everything else is going to be vying for that viable, nice arable land, and it's going to be an incredibly martial and very, very advanced human society which is adapted to fend off anything that comes near them. They're used to fighting off hordes of orcs and goblins, and they will have massive city walls and missile technology and all sorts of stuff, early warning systems and signal flares and that sort of thing, and they'll be martial in their aspect. Whereas if life is relatively easy across the entire belt of the mountain ranges. Nice cultivated land, and there's scatterings of forests and things like that, and the mountains are epic. Then you'll have elves and dwarves and humans living in relative harmony, along with gnomes and other sylvan creatures which move around because things are relatively peaceful. They might have problems with sea raiders, though, if they happen to have quite a harsh, dry island environment not too far offshore. Look at these sort of things and piece them together, make them make sense. Yeah, and have fun with it, man. That's the main thing. When you're creating a world, create the world that you want to play your game in. Create a world that you want to enrich and spend a lot of time thinking about, that you really enjoy imagining and bringing to life for your characters, for your players. And yeah, and certainly ask them before you start a game and get a lot of feedback and stuff, and give them little questions like, what sort of monster would you most fear facing, or what sort of monster have you always wanted to have in your D&D game that you face off against, and get their feedback and design your world accordingly. Yeah, because you're all playing together. All right, thanks for listening to this rather epically long 20-minute video. I hope it was enjoyable, and if you have any feedback, please let me know. If there's any other sort of subjects around Monsterology that you think I could cover, yeah, please, comments below. I welcome them, always. Oh, by the way, also, I just passed my 100th video on YouTube the other day, so hey! And also thanks to my something like 630 subscribers. Whoa! Awesome. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I'll see you later.